Paying the Piper, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Of course, I've always thought there was something dark about those stories. Though we read them to our children, allowing them to drip from the ends of our tongues, coated in the sweetness of affection, without a second thought, we often fail to recognize the acid laced within these words, the malevolent undercurrent that swirls just beneath the surface. For whilst fairy tales are sanitized and cleaned up for our Disney-packaged interpretations, you only need to go back a century or two to trace these willowy branches back to the roots, and suddenly things become far more sinister. I had always suspected this to be the case, but it wasn't until 2016 that I truly began to fear the sound of a flute or pipe. It was not until the arrival of the vial and the note that I realized, whilst we dismiss these stories of magic and sorcery as fantasies of the impossible, impossible is only a measure of what has not yet been done. When those seemingly impossible things become reality, when the fantasies manifest in real life, they are not the clean, sanitized version that we know. Instead, they are born into this world in strange and wicked shapes. Considering what came after, it seems almost comical that the whole thing started with a single vial of a yellowish ochre liquid. In recent years, all mail that arrived at the police precinct, no matter what it was, has had to be tested. With the threat of chemical attacks and cases of things like ricin and anthrax being sent to targets through the mail, you can never be too careful. I think the suspicion is heightened by the fact that the stuff is actually sent via the snail mail in the first place. Unless you're actually expecting a letter, some documentation or a package from someone, then to receive an actual letter nowadays immediately rings alarm bells. 9 times out of 10, anything that needs sending, be it correspondence or documents, can be sent via email. An unexpected package is unusual, and therefore, in the police precinct at least, suspect. That isn't to say the police don't still receive mail. All kinds of documents and official memoranda like certificates and records have to be signed and sent back on their way by recorded delivery. So, before anything comes upstairs from the mailroom, it is checked with metal detectors, and the sniffer dogs do sweeps of virtually all of the mailrooms a few times a day. Despite all that caution, every now and again something gets through. A few months back, someone sent through a razor blade that had been used in an assault. About a year ago, one officer sitting at their desk casually opened a package to find a human thumb placed neatly inside. These things do happen. I have never been in a position to receive one of these packages myself. In fact, I only know about these protocols and incidents because my husband is a cop in the city, and he has complained loudly about it on many occasions. I only knew about the vial because I had to put it on Mayor Danbridge's digest. Even then, I did not attach that news to the flyers. Initially, the two things seemed entirely unrelated. The flyers themselves had begun appearing all over town around a week earlier. You would find them strapped to telegraph poles, placed under the windscreen wipers of cars, and covering every available notice board in town. Each morning people would throw them away, giving them perhaps a cursory glance before balling them up and tossing them in the nearest trash can, or filing them away on the back seat of their cars to dispose of later. The flyers were given short shrift, mostly because of the fact that they didn't actually say much. They appeared each morning and so had clearly been distributed at night or in the early hours of the morning, but a single glance at the image confirmed that whoever was going to such effort to distribute them was wasting their time. No real information could be gleaned from them, and most people simply ignored them. The flyers themselves were all of a dry, off-yellow tinge, and looked as if they had been printed on long-aged paper, or the leaves of books that had stood on shelves untouched and unread for centuries. The colour and texture made me think of when we would make treasure maps in class as children, staining the paper with coffee grounds or tea bags and leaving them to dry so that they emerged yellow-brown with the fragile, crinkled texture of dried leaves. These sheets, however, did not seem to have been artificially aged and had clearly been sourced for the purpose. The image on the flyer, which was not accompanied by any text, was equally archaic, printed in a smudged press of black ink that made it resemble some medieval woodcut or etching. The image showed a thin man in what looked like a magician or jester's outfit. He wore a floppy pointed hat of the type one saw Victorian men in pictures retiring to bed in, and which made me think immediately of Ebenezer Scrooge. This figure was not resting, however, but was instead posed in a way that made him look as if he were dancing, one leg bent and the other raised at an angle before him. Against his lips he had a flute or pipe of some description placed. The whole image made me think of depictions I had seen of the god Pan playing his panpipes, or a pixie blowing into a piccolo and prancing lightly through the forest. The image was arresting, but with no words or context was also entirely forgettable. At first I assumed it was an advertisement, perhaps for the opening of a new music store or band, or perhaps a piece of clever marketing for a market or bookstore, the mysterious element being part of the marketing strategy to get people talking. Some did, but only briefly. It was only later, when the whole story emerged, that I realized that the flyers were a warning, a declaration of arrival and intent. They would spread a story, create a myth, and possibly put a horrifying exclamation point on a tragedy. Still, at the time, I never linked the flyers to the vial. Neither did the mayor, for whilst the vial made it onto the Morning Digest, the flyers did not. I had been working as secretary for the mayor for just over 2 years, and every morning before he arrived at the office spent around 90 minutes putting together the briefing digest, basically an overview or summary of everything he needed to know for that day. The document, which Danbridge insisted should be concise and condensed to the point that it only ever covered 2 sides of A4, was essentially a bullet-point guide to the local news, political shifts, or major events and scheduled events within the town. Whilst one might expect that in a small town such as ours the bullet points would be minimal and the news around town barely able to fill a single sheet of A4, never mind both sides, you would be mistaken. The fact that such a document exposition and that many other offices knew that it existed meant that the briefing digest was seen as an opportunity for lobbying. The place to be if you wanted the mayor's attention or favour, and the agenda to be noted upon if you wanted your issue attended to first. It was no accident that each morning I was greeted by a barrage of emails from various groups, authorities and organisations, all wanting to make sure that their particular interest got on the agenda for that day. To say that there was sometimes pressure from certain quarters to ensure that they had a bullet point outlining their interests is an understatement. I have been offered bribes, given gifts, and even shouted at and threatened by some parties hoping to get onto the digest. I, however, prided myself in being completely impartial and only putting onto the briefing what really needed to be there. On that particular day, my interest was piqued by an email from the police chief saying that they had received a package containing a small, sealed vial of liquid. Obviously, my first thought was of my husband and the possibility that such an object could spell out an immediate threat to his health. I was comforted by the thought that if there were someone wanting to launch a chemical attack, they were highly unlikely to choose our tiny town, yet there was always the possibility of some lone nutjob with a grudge. I read the memo at speed, hoping to be reassured, and, to my relief, was comforted by what I read. The memo explained and indeed stressed that the vial was sealed and that there was no threat of the contents escaping or there being any contamination of the police headquarters, and that the vial had been sent for testing. There was also mention of a message delivered with the vial, though the contents of the message were not included in the memo, and I assumed would be shared with the mayor privately during a briefing that was scheduled for the following afternoon. These briefings between the chief of police and the mayor were usually short and polite affairs that I had minuted many times, but rarely contained anything as intriguing as a mystery vial. It's ironic to think of it now, but knowing that the matter would be discussed the following day, I was at first genuinely excited. By mid-afternoon, that excitement had drained away completely and been replaced by something that more closely resembled fear. It was clear that the scheduled meeting was much too far away. The contents had been tested, and the level of concern expressed by the chief of police far higher than it had been in the almost casual-sounding email earlier that morning. A number of terse phone calls between the police headquarters and the mayor's office emphasized the fact that the matter was urgent and that the chief of police could not wait until the following day. He needed to see the mayor either right now or as close to right now as humanly possible. I cleared the afternoon and made the arrangements. Initially, I was relieved when I was asked to sit in and minute the meeting. I'll admit that the urgency and the inclusion of this mystery liquid had made me not a little concerned. I spent much of the morning trying unsuccessfully to forget about the vial and the fact that the chief of police had expressed such urgency. By the time the hour approached, I was positively champing at the bit, and I didn't just want to know what was going on. I needed to. The chief, a burly, stocky-looking man in his mid-50s who sported a prodigious moustache that made him look a bit like a walrus, was invited by the mayor to take a seat, but instead chose to stand, straight-backed and rigid on the other side of the desk. Danbridge, meanwhile, leant back in his chair and encouraged the chief to say what needed saying. The chief glanced momentarily at me, and the mayor assured him that he could speak in the strictest confidence, without fear of me leaking. Reassured by this, the chief began his explanation by asking an oddly obtuse question.
"Mr. Mayor, do you know what toxoplasmosis is?"
I noted the question and regarded the chief curiously. Whether the mayor had heard of toxoplasmosis or not, I didn't know, but I certainly had. I knew from my first pregnancy that it was considered unwise for pregnant women to clear litter trays of cats because of the risk of toxoplasmosis. I also knew of an old college friend who, having contracted an infection that compromised his immune system, had died of some complication relating to toxoplasmosis. In lieu of an answer, the mayor instead inhaled deeply. "What's this about, Art?" he asked finally. The chief looked decidedly grave as he began to explain.
Toxoplasmosis involves a parasite. It is most often found in vermin and in cats.
I nodded to myself in confirmation of my own identification of the disease.
Thing is, there are some very peculiar effects associated with toxoplasmosis in rodents.
The mayor raised an eyebrow, and clearly as confused as to where this was going as I was, echoed the chief's words. "Rodent?" he said, with a slight tilt of the head. "Do we have some kind of infestation problem? Because I can have the Department of Health on it in a few minutes, if we do." Now it was the chief's turn to sigh, a momentary signal of exasperation meant to indicate subtly that the entire story would be revealed much quicker without the mayor's interruptions and attempts to second-guess the reason for the meeting.
"No, sir. In fact, we have somewhat the opposite problem. It's like this," the chief went on, still standing straight-backed and staring, it seemed to me, past the mayor and into the space behind him. In rodents, toxoplasmosis affects the brain. It essentially reprograms them. The mayor's brow furrowed in a manner that seemed to indicate increasing impatience, and he shot me a glance that at once asked whether I was hearing this too, and whether this is really what he had to cancel his other meetings for. I'll admit that even I was a little lost as to where the chief was going with this, and a little apprehensive of the dressing down I would get after the meeting if it proved to be less important than I had made it out to be. Obviously, it's just instinct for any rodent to be fearful of cats. You don't want to be around the thing that's going to eat you or tear you apart for fun. To want to run from or avoid a natural predator is normal. Rats and mice are particularly good at it. Sometimes there doesn't need to be an actual cat present. They will run from any indicator that a cat has been in the area. If you put a rat into a room that a cat has been in an hour earlier, it doesn't matter how much food is on offer. If they see a single cat hair, they will flee. They react to the sounds of a cat's collar bell, to shapes and shadows that resemble cats, and they are especially attuned to feline smells, in particular the cat's urine. As this final sentence left the chief's mouth, it was met with the violent scrape of the mayor's chair against the polished wooden floor as he pushed it back and rose to his feet. I had seen this gesture before, usually before some heated tirade directed at an underling who had not performed his duties correctly, or a campaign manager whose tactics were proving ineffectual. In those instances, the mayor would rise to his feet, the chair scraping violently backward, and, rising to his feet, bellow some admonishment or other in their general direction whilst beating his fist on the desk. For a moment, I wondered whether the chief was about to get the same treatment and actually became a little worried about how he might react to such a dressing down. On this occasion, however, the mayor did not shout, and instead of slamming his knuckles into the desk, he pressed them into its surface and lowered his head. "Chief Morton, I am sorry, but I'm sure you'll appreciate that I'm a rather busy man, and whilst I would love to sit here and continue this fascinating discussion about cat's piss, I unfortunately have more pressing matters to attend to, so if you wouldn't mind." Raising his hand, he gestured towards the door. The chief remained silent, and as still and solid as a fence post, as if his feet had been cemented in place. Then, very calmly, but with an authority that even the mayor couldn't ignore, said, "Sit down, Mr. Mayor. You need to hear this." At first, Danbridge seemed stunned by the directness of this order, and I thought perhaps he was going to whip out his famous "You work for me" line, but he didn't. There was something about the chief, about the rigid stillness of the man, like a stalagmite that had grown up there over centuries, that unnerved him. The chief was serious, and that meant, by implication, that the matter he was here to discuss was serious too, even if it did seem to be about cat's pee. When rodents are infected with toxoplasmosis, they lose their caution around cat urine. In fact, instead of rejecting or being repelled by it, they instead become attracted to it, seeking it out, moving towards and remaining wherever the urine is found. Instead of running away from the predator, they run towards it. I saw the mayor's face crinkle as he put together the implications of this change. The parasite's ultimate goal is not to be in rodents, but in cats, so to achieve this it changes the rodent's natural instincts, alters their brain chemistry, and reconditions them and drives them toward their predators. It's actually extraordinary when you think about it. "And terrifying," Danbridge added, to nodding agreement from the chief. "A parasite does this. I mean, it's capable of changing the animal's behavior, making it do things that are bad, well, deadly for it." The chief nodded. "Obviously, if it were possible to replicate this effect in human beings, to, as it were, bring them towards what they were trying to avoid, it would have massive implications. Firstly, it would be morally questionable because it would lead to questions about mind control, free will, and consent. Secondly, it would give one military a distinct advantage over the other." Suddenly, Danbridge's face began to change, switching from the hardened, dismissive aspect it had retained up until that point, and melting into something new. "But that's just hypothetical, right? I mean, it's one thing to make a rat think or act differently, but people are thinking animals. They make their own decisions. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but such a thing isn't actually possible in real life. Is it?" The chief paused for a moment and slung a look in my direction, hesitating for a moment about whether or not to continue in my presence. Mayor Danbridge nodded that I was fine, clearly investing a lot of faith in the non-disclosure agreement that I am now about to break. "Honestly, sir, if we hadn't sent that vial for testing, I would not have been told any of this. The information I have been given hasn't officially come through any recognized channel. If we try to discuss this at a state or federal level, the conversation will be shut down and any communication denied. Having said that, we are lucky that information was shared. It means we still have time."
Taking a laptop from his satchel and placing it on the mayor's desk, the chief opened it and, after glancing up momentarily to check that he had our full attention, hit play on a video file he had opened and prepared. The first short clip, that switched between shots and seemingly between locations, showed two distinct crowds of people, some in smocks, overalls, and the conical hats common in Vietnam and Laos. Another showed men in what seemed to be Middle Eastern dress. In the first clip, the crowd were surrounded by foliage and greenery. In the second, rocky outcrops like mountains or desert. In both short clips, the throng of hundreds were walking in slow procession towards the camera and then out of shot. The first clip is from Vietnam, 1970. The information that came along with the clip suggests that along with Agent Orange and the other defoliants that the US dropped on the jungles in that region, another, far more experimental chemical compound, laced with a toxoplasmosis derivative proxy, was sprayed during aerial assaults in aerosol form. Gesturing at the screen, the mayor balked at the suggestion. "They can't do that. They can't just drop experimental chemicals onto people, even in a war situation. I mean, they wouldn't." He trailed off, shouted down not by any protest or counter-argument, but by the chief's continued silence. When he did eventually respond, it was in a quiet, almost whispered voice. "I'm sure you remember those photographs of the naked girl running down the road crying, covered in napalm," the chief said with a stern matter-of-fact pointedness that landed with leaden weight. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. They could, they would, and they have. "Days later," the chief continued, "a dozen villages emptied as villagers simply walked out of the forest and toward the nearest US stronghold. What exactly compelled them to make the journey and what they were attracted to isn't clear, but it's a hell of a coincidence." The second clip is from Afghanistan, 2004. Groups of insurgents who had been hiding out in the mountains for what amounted to years suddenly, and without prompting, began to march out of their hiding places and onto the main roads. He played the clip again. Suddenly, what had previously been a slightly unsettling clip of people walking together took on a new and far more ominous implication. On the second viewing, their steps seemed to be labored, their feet dragged in heavy, shuffling steps, as if their muscles, ligaments, and tendons were forcing them inescapably forward as their bones, their minds, and their will fought and struggled to push them backwards. Worse still, on second viewing, the clip ran longer, and in some snatched glances I caught sight of the faces. Grown men, their mouths hanging slackly open in horrible, empty wails as tears streamed down their faces. Their hands hung limply by their sides, unable to strike out or resist their inevitable slow march onwards. It was like watching footage from some cheap zombie movie, but one in which, rather than lumbering forwards with an insatiable hunger, the zombies were instead forced, dragged, or pushed by some irresistible urge forwards, their conscious mind resisting as their body overruled. They were not forced by threat of bombardment or coerced with promises of land or financial gain. There was no logical reason whatsoever for them to come to the US soldiers other than the chemicals that had been dropped over the area in an attempt to contaminate the local water supply. I watched as Danbridge, stunned and silent, wiped his mouth, his eyes fixed on the footage. "So you're saying that the stuff in the vial, it was something similar to this stuff? Why? I mean, what's the point?" Rather than answering directly, the chief opened a document on his desktop, a photograph of a note which had presumably come along with the vial, and beside it what looked like a mugshot of a distinctly rattish-looking man. "Roland Dürer. He's a German-American who worked for the US military in development for over 30 years. He was dishonorably discharged 5 years ago at the end of what should have been a glittering career. I don't know the reasons why, as they have been suppressed, but it was enough for them to deny him his pension, and he apparently only avoided a court-martial due to lack of evidence. He has held a grudge against the military and the United States government ever since.
We know from documentation we have received that he worked in the same department believed to have been working on the manufacturing of a toxoplasmosis-based compound. The vial we were sent might not be identical to that, and was probably manufactured by Dürer himself, but it is remarkably similar to the experimental compound alleged to have been used during these conflicts. To put it bluntly, he has access to this stuff and is threatening to use it. I stared up at the photograph of the man, at the slender and yet gently hooked nose, the eyebrow arches that rose to almost triangular points, making the thin, drawn face look almost like a caricature, its exaggerated length coupled with the crooked smile, making him look like nothing so much as Mr. Punch, whilst the warts, one on the end of the nose and another above the right eye, gave Dürer the look of some villain from a book of fairy tales. I have never believed that you can read one's character in their appearance, but it is fair to say that there was something instantly dislikable about Dürer's features, something that made you instantly suspect that if he offered you an apple, it would be laced with poison. As the chief spoke, I read the note that was now displayed on screen. I instantly recognized the paper as being the same as that on which the flyers that had plastered the town were printed, that same ancient-looking texture, the yellowed surface and blurry black ink. Above the words was the same strange image of the prancing pixie or jester, a figure I would recognize from that point on as the Piper. As I read the words printed below, the link to the strange image began to become clear. We all pay the Piper, shillings, pence, and crowns. Yield our silver pieces, or the Piper comes to town. Below the cryptic ditty was a series of numbers that I assumed corresponded to a bank account, and below those the figure $10,000 and a date 1 week from the date of the meeting. As I finished reading, the mayor waved his hand toward the screen. His face had turned a yogurty shade of white. So this is what? Some kind of extortion or blackmail? What's with this cryptic nonsense? I mean, who does he think he is? Something from a Batman comic? The chief's expression never changed. No, he responded flatly. He thinks he's the Pied Piper. Now Danbridge turned to me. Rather than the relaxed, self-assured figure he had been 10 minutes earlier, he was now a fidgeting mess. He kept straightening and smoothing out his tie, running his fingers through his hair, and, having risen from his seat, was now pacing back and forth behind the desk, before stopping and addressing me directly. Not a word of this leaves this office, you understand? Not a word. I nodded, showing that I understood. Danbridge then turned back to the chief. So what does he want? I mean, I see he wants money, but for what? If we don't pay, he'll take us all on some fun run or lead us somewhere? What? The chief beckoned him to retake his seat and leaned forward towards the laptop. You remember how the Pied Piper of Hamelin story ends? He asked. Again, Danbridge turned to me, then back to the chief. He began nervously. The piper rids the town of their rats, right? He plays his pipe and skips along and all the rats follow him out of the village and into the river to drown or something. That's right, isn't it? The chief shook his head. You're right up to a point, but after he completes the task, the townsfolk refuse to pay him. As punishment, he plays a different tune, and this time, instead of rats, it's the children of the city who begin to follow him. He leads them away in a long procession out of town, never to be seen again. Danbridge's mouth hung open. He twice attempted to speak, but was stopped, choked into silence by the realization of what was being threatened. Finally, he was saved from the requirement to speak by the chief, who went on with a stoic, matter-of-fact tone and pressed the play button on the screen. This is a small village in Germany from 3 years ago. A week before this footage emerged, the mayor of the town received a letter, in German, from someone calling himself Hamelin. He demanded money against a threat to play out the fairy tale. If he has this chemical, he can induce the townsfolk, the children, the rats, to follow him or to march toward a certain point, just like the rats do through their attraction to the cat's urine. He'd enclosed a printout of the Pied Piper story. This footage was taken 8 days later.
On screen, an amalgam of short clips taken from various CCTV cameras housed in different locations flashed one after another. The footage showed a slow procession through the streets as scores of children in all their pajamas and nightgowns walked, barefoot and seemingly mesmerized, in a slow, constant march down the darkened streets toward the start of the forest. Each child, dampened by the light rain, stared wide-eyed toward the tree line, the edge of the forest and the dark that waited for them there. There was panic and terror in those eyes, and yet they continued walking, one step after another, as if dragged on a long string or reeled in on a fishing line. With the final shots, the children began to disappear. One after another they streamed like a slow stampede between the trees, vanishing into a space between the branches, swallowed by the deep, black darkness of the forest.
46 children went missing that night. None have yet been found. The incident was suppressed, covered up, and the media forbidden to report on it, but since the investigation, this footage has spread through various channels. The piper came to town, and he took them. Dambridge exploded.
But he can't. He can't get away with this. He needs to be caught. We can't just fold and give in or give this guy the money. What is it they're attracted to, and how did the stuff get to them?
The chief shrugged.
It could be in the water. It could be in the school meals. A bad batch of soda spread through the town. It could be anything. But listen, I'm not one for negotiating with terrorists. Ordinarily. But...
Here he bowed his head and trailed off for a moment. He brought his hand to his mouth and coughed, clearing his throat.
I have grandchildren, you know. We checked our own CCTV in town. This is from 3 days ago.
Again the chief pressed play. The image on screen was familiar to me, though in an unfamiliar aspect. It was the main street in town, but shown in the early hours of the morning. With the stores and businesses all shuttered up, the streets empty of people, the place looked eerily empty and unnervingly still. I observed the long promenade that led past the town hall in which I was sitting at that very moment, the cones of light produced by the street lamps, and the cold grey blue of the concrete and cement. At first, this seemed to be simply footage of an empty street, a soft rustling crackle coming from the one camera that had an audio feed. Then, slowly, from one side of the screen, a figure appeared. A man, painfully alone, and seemingly dressed in a Halloween costume that made him look like a harlequin or court jester, complete with pointed hat and shoes that curled comically at the toe, treading in slow, deliberate, and almost balletic movements down the street. With each step he cast a long, crooked shadow onto the tarmac, a shadow that, though it was warped by movement and the angle of the lights, looked as if it had been printed onto the road, an exact replica of the image from the flyers. There was something about the man's movements, the jaunty, spring-heeled prance that he was taking through the centre of town in the dead of night, that was unsettling in its incongruity. He seemed to almost be skipping, like some strange little goblin, until he came to a stop and, raising his head with slow, deliberate movements, stared directly into one of the cameras observing his movements, and grinned an awful, wicked smile. From some sheath attached to his leg, he removed what looked to me to be a long flute, without breaking his fixed gaze on the camera lens, brought it to his lips. He then turned and continued his slow-motion skipping down the main street. The sound of the music he produced, a quick, jaunty tune, yet played in mournful, keening minor keys, sounded like something that might come from a child's music box, but was not a tune that I recognized. He played for a few seconds before looking back over his shoulder. Then we saw the rats. At first they came as individuals, slithering plump and wet from the drains, squeezing themselves through the metal grids. Then they came in dozens, then scores. After only a few moments they ceased to be distinguishable as individuals, and instead became a single black mass, flowing and undulating like a liquid down the main street, and at the front of this verminous procession, the piper, playing and skipping happily. This was clearly meant as a demonstration, a way of showing that whilst it might be ripped from the pages of some dark fairy tale, though it might be something we would usually consider impossible, here he was, doing it as if to show that nothing was impossible, and that if his demands were not met, there was far more that he could do. At one point he paused, clearly aware of where every camera was, playing and performing to them, knowing that someone, in the days that followed, would be watching as we were now. Reaching into another pocket, he produced a slip of paper and held it up before his sick grin so that the words could be seen on screen. They read, Die Kinder als nächstes. Both Danbridge and I looked over at the chief for a translation. Without waiting for us to ask, he intoned flatly, The children next. There was a short pause, after which Danbridge's head sank. Then, in a soft, almost defeated whisper, he said, Pay him. And like that, it was done. From somewhere within the budget, balanced with some clever accounting and with the full consent of the police department, the sum of $10,000 was wired to a secure account. In the years following this incident, we were kept abreast of developments through the same back channel that had originally contacted the chief. He informed us that 4 other towns, 2 in Europe, 1 in North Africa, and 1 in Canada, had been contacted, and that all of them had paid out. In an attempt to combat this epidemic of blackmail and neutralize the threat, government scientists had been working on a compound that would neutralize the impact of the chemical that led to this irresistible attraction. A number of plans were put forward, including inoculation in all schools, additives being put into cafeteria food, and in a suggestion eerily reminiscent of past crimes, even an aerosol drop of counteracting chemicals over population centers that were threatened. It was considered a foregone conclusion that it was Durer's work with the toxoplasmosis proxy that had allowed him to attract and lead the children and rats against their will, to instill within them some irresistible urge to follow, even to the point of their own deaths. Durer must, it was reasoned, have sprayed himself with some attracting protein or scent that would make him the bellwether that the affected had to follow. It was a simple but undoubtedly perverted use of biology and chemistry. The pipe, they said, was simply for show, part of the deliberate showmanship Durer engaged in to intimidate his victims. There was no scientific explanation for why a tune played on a pipe would be an attractant. What was never explained, however, was why, in the German town, where an entire school full of kids had gone missing, all following the piper's call, 2 children had remained soundly asleep in their beds and were seemingly unaffected. Surely it cannot be a coincidence that these 2 children just happened to be deaf. As of December 2020, Roland Durer has not been found. Neither, I am sorry to say, have the children. This has been Paying the Piper, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell, copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort, production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.